A new female body arrived at the morgue. The way of death is very strange. From the appearance, the body was clean and intact without any trauma, but the ankles and wrists were all broken. The eyes were also gray and cloudy. There was no trace of blood. You can see that the body has been buried for a long time. But the strange thing is, the joints under the skin are unusually soft and flexible. This is a feature that only fresh corpses have. What's more frightening is that the woman's tongue was cut off. One tooth was also missing. What is the deepest hatred to make the woman suffer such a misfortune? Faced with doubts, Coroner Jack could only continue the autopsy, but one after another, something unnatural happened. The victim's blood gushed out. This means the body had been dead for less than an hour, and the body had obviously been dead for a long time. Jack used a tool to cut the body's rib cage. He found the woman's waist was very thin. It was as if she had been wearing a girdle for a long time, but his son David said the girdle hadn't been worn for at least 300 years. Then Jack examined the body's heart. He found that it was covered with scars. Then he found that the body's lungs were blackened.
She could smoke 10 packs a day for 30 years. Couldn't explain this.
From this, we can deduce that she should have died of asphyxiation from smoke, but the skin of the deceased was white and smooth. There is no trace of burns. Next, Jack found a decaying flower from the victim's stomach. A decaying flower. After comparing the flowers, he found that they were called mandarins. It can be used as an anesthetic in medicine. The two men were about to continue the autopsy. Suddenly there was a strange noise outside the door. David went out to check, seeing the mirror reflected in the corner of the corridor. Surprisingly, there was a person standing, and when he went up to check, but found empty. The oddity of what he saw made David want to give up. He came back to persuade his father. Why don't we just rest for today? Let's continue tomorrow. But Jack said he promised the police the results tonight. Even if you are afraid, you must continue. Then father and son found a piece of the victim's intestine. They found a piece of cloth with a mysterious design and numbers on a scrap of cloth. There was also a tooth wrapped inside. Jack seemed to remember something. He found that the tooth in the rag was the same one that the victim was missing. At that moment, all the evidence was pointing to the fact the lady should have died in some kind of cult ritual. To test his suspicions, Jack continued to dissect the body. Finally, he found something on the inside of the skin. There were mysterious symbols on it, just like on the rags. Just at that moment, the door of the morgue opened. David hurriedly took out his flashlight and lit up the front. To their surprise, all the bodies in the freezer disappeared. The father and son then realized the seriousness of the problem. They rushed to call for help, but David's phone had no signal. Good thing there is still a landline in the office. Jack dialed the police station's phone, but the phone signal seems to be jammed. The other party could not hear what he was saying. At that moment, there was a sudden ringing at the door. Father and son knew exactly what this meant. In the tradition of the coroner, each corpse should have a bell attached to its ankle. If the bell rings, it means the person is still alive. David was brave enough to look through the doorway. Father and son worked together against the door. Finally, the door was quiet. Jack walked to the bathroom while cleaning the wound on his wrist. While thinking about what to do, suddenly David saw behind the curtain there was a ghostly figure. David was relieved. The door to the bathroom was also locked. David used all his strength to break open the door. He found his father knocked to the ground. His father, who had come to his senses, told David that the attacker had the same eyes as the woman. He then concluded that the woman was responsible for the attack. The two men thought no more. They rushed back to the autopsy room and prepared to burn the body to end it all. David grabbed the gasoline and threw it on the body to set her on fire, but the fire suddenly went out of control. In an instant, the entire morgue was on fire. Jack rushed to grab a fire extinguisher to put out the fire. After the fire was put out, David couldn't believe his eyes. The woman's body was still intact. Now the father and son had only one thing on their minds: run, get out of here. And then the familiar bell came again from the other end of the corridor. This time, the father and son finally saw it clearly. David rushed to open the elevator door and his father to hide inside. But the elevator door at the critical moment but stuck. How to close it cannot be closed. The bell was getting closer and closer. Jack raised his axe. At the moment, the zombie is close to cut it down. After going out to check, the two were surprised to find the one who was cut down was their son's girlfriend. Because before David and his girlfriend met at 10 o'clock to go to the movies. And at that moment the power of the elevator finally restored. Too late to grieve. Jack dragged his son back to the elevator. Despair and a sense of powerlessness filled this small elevator. The grieving David finds that the closer he gets to the truth, the more paranormal things happen. This must be the dead woman stopping them. Now instead of waiting here to die, it's better to risk going back and finding out the truth. If we find out why the woman died, maybe we can stop her. So they went back to the autopsy room for the final part of the autopsy, craniotomy. The assistants cut off a large piece of brain tissue under the microscope. Surprisingly, the brain cells of the deceased were very active. In other words, it wasn't a corpse lying on the table. She was still alive. At this point, the only clue left in the hands of father and son was the piece of cloth. David folded up the piece of cloth. The original scattered words were actually pieced together into two clues. Chapter 27 of the Bible and the year 1693. Jack hurriedly took out the Bible from the bookshelf and turned to the corresponding chapter. It turned out that the girl died in some kind of evil sacrifice ritual, and David also thought of the witch trials that had happened 300 years ago. Many innocent girls had been executed, but the sacrifice that was supposed to destroy the witch created the real witch in front of him. The reason why the corpse didn't kill the father and son now, it was to complete the witch's ritual. Only when the ritual was completed would the curse on her body disappear. At that moment, another living corpse tries to break in. David rushes to block the door. Jack took the opportunity to tell the lady his terms. He was willing to suffer everything, help her to complete the ritual, but he also asked her not to hurt his son. As soon as the words left his mouth, Jack felt pain like never before. His arms and legs were broken. His mouth was spitting white smoke, and his eyes became cloudy. At the same time, the wounds on the lady's body also gradually recovered. The eyes became clear. The blood began to flow back. The wounds from the dissection were healing. Jack, who had fallen to the ground, looked at the scalpel not far away. He asked his son to help him get out of his own way, to save his father from pain. David had to painfully plunge the knife into his father's heart. With Jack's death, the power in the room was restored. Outside the door, there were still shouts from the police. David rushed to the door, wanted them to get himself out, but only a moment later, the police shouting turned into a horrible song. David understood. The ritual of the female corpse is not yet over. At that moment, the sound of bells came from downstairs again. David looked down but found nothing below. But in the blink of an eye, David fell to his death. Early the next morning, the police investigated the scene. There were no obvious signs of a break-in. All the evidence and autopsy reports were destroyed by the fire. Jack had no wounds except for a scalpel sticking out of his chest. No more wounds. David died in a fall. The morgue was a mess. Only the group of women's bodies remained intact. The sheriff had no choice, had to send the women's bodies to a new morgue. Suddenly,